Okay, let's be real for a second. You saw the number 3.6 megapascals, 1,000-year high. Right on a fault near LA if you're in Southern California. I know that cold wave of dread hit you. I felt it too. But here's the thing. Every headline that led with that number got the story wrong. Not a little wrong. Fundamentally wrong. They buried the real discovery so deep that if you only read the news, you'd walk away thinking stress is high. Big one coming. Which is technically true, but it's like saying the engine is hot right before the car explodes. The real discovery isn't a number. It's a mechanism. A gate. And that gate sits 50 miles northeast of downtown LA at a place called Cajon Pass. So let me back up and give you the full picture. Because I promise you, this is not the same earthquake warning you've heard 1,000 times. This is new. This is specific. And it changes the definition of worst-case scenario for 20 million people. The research was published in a top geophysics journal. Lead author is Dr. Lilian Burkhardt from the University of Bern in Switzerland. Her team includes researchers from the U.S., Geological Survey, Scripps Institution of Oceanography, and Northern Arizona University. These are not YouTube doomsayers. These are established, peer-reviewed scientists, and what they found, when you actually read past the abstract into the physics, should change how you think about the ground beneath your feet. Here's the setup. The San Andreas Fault runs across Cajon Pass from the northwest. The San Jacinto Fault runs up to meet it from the southeast. Between these two fault systems lies a junction, a narrow mountain gap where they come within a few miles of each other. That junction is the gate. Now here's where the headlines failed you. The stress numbers are not the story. The story is what those numbers mean when you look at them together. On one side of the gate, the San Jacinto segment, stress is at 3.6 megapascals, the highest in 1,000 years. On the other side, the Mojave segment of the San Andreas is at 2.8 megapascals, both at record highs. But the critical finding, and one thing that should keep every emergency, the planner in this state awake at night, is the relationship between them. A difference of 0.8 megapascals. And the question the scientists are asking, does that difference mean the gate is opening or locking? Because a gate, as the researchers describe it, is not a wall, and it's not a funnel. A wall always stops what's coming. A funnel always lets things through. A gate is something in between. It responds to conditions. It's open sometimes, closed other times. And what decides which state it's in is not the raw size of the earthquake approaching it, it's the stress balance on both sides of the junction at the moment of rupture. If both faults are loaded equally, pushing in the same direction, the rupture will tear across the junction and involve both fault systems simultaneously. That's a through-going rupture, that's the gate open. And the magnitude climbs accordingly. A rupture confined to one fault system, regional earthquake, severe but contained. A rupture that crosses the junction and rips through both systems. That's a different beast entirely. Dr. Burkhardt puts the range at magnitude 7.4 to 7.8. Now, you might think, okay, 7.8. That's bad, but not planet-ending. Let me give you a comparison that should make you sit up straight. In 1857, the Fort Tejon earthquake struck the southern San Andreas. It was approximately magnitude 7.9. It tore a surface scar roughly 220 miles long. By any measure, one of the most powerful earthquakes in California's recorded history. And it killed 2 people. Why not? Because California got lucky. Because in 1857, that 220 miles of fault ran almost entirely through empty land, empty valleys, uninhabited ridges. There was no city in the way, no grid of neighborhoods, highways, hospitals, and apartment towers sitting directly on top of the breaking ground. In 2026, a through-going rupture at Cajon Pass would channel its energy directly into corridors where roughly 20 million people live and work. The San Gabriel Valley, the Inland Empire, the Coachella Valley, Greater Los Angeles, San Bernardino, Riverside. The geography of destruction is not the geography of 1857, even if the magnitude is similar. Here's the piece that should genuinely disturb you. California has already run this experiment twice. In 1812, an earthquake ruptured the San Andreas, crossed the Cajon Pass junction, and continued onto the San Jacinto. The gate was open. At Mission San Juan Capistrano, the bell tower collapsed during morning prayer and crushed dozens of worshippers. In 1857, the Fort Tejon earthquake, the same one that killed only 2 people, ruptured the southern San Andreas, ran 220 miles south, and stopped cold at Cajon Pass. The gate was closed. 2 massive earthquakes, 45 years apart, arriving at the exact same junction, getting 2 completely different answers. The question that has haunted seismologists for over a century is, why? What determined that difference? Because if we can answer that, we might finally know what today's stress imbalance means for us right now. In 2026, that's what this study cracked open. And the answer, fair warning, is not what you'd hope to hear. So this 3.6 megapascals number, it's been everywhere on your feed, right? And let's be honest, if you're like most people, that number means absolutely nothing to you. And that's exactly why the headlines could get away with missing the real story. So let's make it real. A megapascal is just a unit of pressure. 1 megapascal is roughly the weight of a mid-sized car, pressing down on a single square inch. Now picture 3.6 of those cars stacked on every single square inch of a fault line that runs for miles beneath Southern California. That's the stress currently sitting on the San Jacinto Bernardino Fault segment. And here's the part that should stop you cold. That's the highest stress this fault has carried in 1,000 years of reconstructed earthquake history. Not 50 years, not 100, 1,000. The last time this piece of the Earth's crust held this kind of load, written history didn't even exist in California. We have zero record of what happened back then. Now, before your brain jumps to some lone conspiracy theorist yelling from his garage, let's talk about who's actually behind this. This research was published in the Journal of Geophysical Research, Solid Earth, one of the most respected peer-reviewed earth science journals on the planet. The lead author is Dr. Lilian Burkhardt, a geophysicist at the University of Bern in Switzerland. And the team also includes researchers from the USGS Earthquake Science Center in Pasadena, Scripps Institution of Oceanography, and Northern Arizona University. These are not internet doomsday prophets. These are literally the people the government calls when they need to know what's actually going on. The USGS doesn't put its name on junk. So when all of these institutions back one finding, you should probably sit up a bit straighter, but here's what honestly ticks me off. While the headline screamed 3.6 megapascals, minus, as you now know, is so abstract it gives you nothing to grab onto, the people who actually wrote the paper were looking at something much more disturbing. They were looking at how 3.6 sits right next to its neighbor. The San Andreas Fault's Mojave South segment sits directly across the junction at Cajon Pass. That segment measured 2.8 megapascals. Both numbers are the highest their respective segments have seen in a millennium. But what matters, and the authors stress this over and over, is the difference between those two numbers. That gap is 0.8 megapascals. Hold on to that number, because 0.8 might be the exact margin that decides whether the next big earthquake stays on one system or rips through both fault systems in one continuous, catastrophic rupture. The researchers describe a mechanism called an earthquake gate. And the gate at Cajon Pass, about 50 miles northeast of downtown LA, that gate currently looks like it's swinging open. I really want you to understand why that 0.8 difference matters more than the 3.6 you've seen plastered everywhere. The headlines told you 3.6 was the story. It wasn't. 3.6 is just context. The real story is what those two numbers, sitting side by side, and the gap between them, tell us about where this region might be heading. And to get there, we have to talk about how earthquakes actually choose their size. It's not about how much energy a fault has stored up, not directly. It's actually much more specific. It depends on where the rupture starts and whether it can cross a junction like Cajon Pass. The size of an earthquake comes down to one dominant factor, the total area of fault that breaks. A rupture that stays on one system creates a certain length of shattered crust and a certain magnitude. But a rupture that crosses that junction that links both systems into one continuous tear through the earth, that's a completely different beast. The two rupture lengths merge into a single event. The magnitude jumps, and the shaking spreads across a region that just happens to be home to 20 million people. So that's the difference between a severe, localized earthquake, the kind California has built code after code to survive, and the kind that fundamentally redraws the map of destruction. And honestly, you probably already know which one we're talking about here. But what you don't know yet about how this gate behaves historically, that part might genuinely keep you up at night. All right, let's clear something up right away, because I know a lot of people have this image in their head. If you think a fault junction is like a solid wall that just stops an earthquake in its tracks, you need to drop that image right now. And if you think it's more like a funnel, squeezing all that energy into one narrow path, yeah, that's not it either. The researchers behind this paper say it's something completely different. They call it a gate, not a wall, not a funnel. A gate doesn't follow fixed rules. It doesn't always stop things. It doesn't always let them through. It swings one way or the other depending on the exact conditions at the exact moment the rupture arrives. Think about that for a second. The exact same earthquake scenario could end up two totally different ways, just based on the stress balance on both sides of that junction when the rupture finally hits. And that's not some nerdy academic detail. And that's the line between two very different kinds of disaster. Now here's where the physical mechanism actually matters. And this part might mess with what you thought you knew. The size of an earthquake isn't really about the raw energy that pops out from the epicenter. We all like to think it is. But that's just not how it works. What actually sets the magnitude is the area of the fault that breaks a rupture, that stays on one fault system, tears a certain length of crust, and that gives you a certain magnitude. But a rupture that crosses a junction and drags two fault systems into the same event, it combines both lengths into a single rupture. Two separate cracks become one long continuous crack. And the magnitude climbs in a way that doesn't feel like simple addition. It jumps. So when we're talking about the San Andreas and the San Jacinto faults coming within just a few miles of each other at Cajon Pass, northeast of Los Angeles, we're not just talking about two faults that happen to look close on a map. We're talking about two separate fault lengths that, under the right conditions, could snap together into one continuous rupture. A rupture that stays on one system. That's a severe regional earthquake, the kind California has drilled for, planned for, and genuinely prepared to ride out. But a rupture that crosses that gate and drags both systems into the same event. That's something substantially worse. Dr. Burkhardt puts it at magnitude 7.4 to 7.8 for a joint rupture crossing Cajon Pass. And yeah, I know that number sounds familiar. We've heard about 7.0 seconds and 7.5 seconds in California our whole lives. It sounds like something we've already accounted for. But hold on, because you need to think about what that number actually means in terms of where the shaking lands. Let's go back to 1857 for a second. The Fort Tejon earthquake, on the southern San Andreas roughly, magnitude 7.9, that quake tore a surface scar about 220 miles long. By any standard, that's one of the most powerful earthquakes in California's written history. And it killed two people, not 2002, why it wasn't luck. And it's not like the earthquake was some gentler force back then. It's because in 1857, that 220 miles of broken fault ran almost entirely through land that was essentially empty. No city in the way, no grid of neighborhoods, no highways, no hospitals, no apartment towers sitting directly on top of ground tearing itself apart. The ground moved, the mountains shifted, and almost nobody was there to feel it. Now take that same class of rupture and map it onto 2026. A through-going rupture at Cajon Pass, one that crosses that gate, would dump its energy into corridors, where roughly 20 million people live and were. The San Gabriel Valley, the Inland Empire, the Coachella Valley, Greater Los Angeles, San Bernardino, Riverside. Every single one of those names is a place with schools, hospitals, highway overpasses, stacks of apartment buildings. The geography of destruction in the 21st century version of this event is fundamentally not the geography of 1857. Even if the magnitude is similar, the physical size of the earthquake might look comparable on paper, but the social footprint of what breaks